All right, welcome to our third lesson for Chapter 8. This is going to be our last lesson on Chapter 8. So Chapter 8 was covering just energy use in general for humans, not focusing on one type of energy. So we've gone through how humans have used energy over time, and then specific uses of energy, and now we're going to talk about the economics and politics of energy and energy trends. So learning objective is that you'll be able to explain the impact that economics and politics have on energy. So there is a direct link between economic growth and the availability of inexpensive energy. What that means is that most industrial societies, so most societies that have strong economic growth, want to ensure that there's a continuous supply of affordable energy, because affordable energy is tied to typically like those societal norms and industry and all of the things that people in industrialized countries expect and kind of need. And the higher the price of energy, the more expensive goods and services become, which means people may use them less. So one thing that exists that we'll talk about not only with energy, but also later in agriculture is subsidies. So subsidies artificially reduce the cost of energy costs. And that's usually that the government is subsidizing something. So the government is kind of paying part of the cost so that the people that are consuming that thing are paying less. And so that it's worth it to continue. All right, so one place that we see a lot of policy is gas, so fuel. So automobile fuel efficiency is one area in which government policy has had a significant impact. Most of the differences in gas prices among countries are the result of taxes and reflect differences in government policy toward motor vehicle transportation. So the blue lines here are the normal gas price without any taxes. So there is a difference. Gas in Canada is a little more expensive without taxes than gas in the United States. Gas in the United States is cheaper than most other, maybe all other places without taxes. But if we look at in Italy, how much of that gas price is taxes and how much is just the base price, it's like 50-50. And this is in US dollars per liter. So we usually do per gallon. So this is going to be obviously a little bit lower because a liter is smaller than a gallon. But just to compare, we tax very, very little on our gas on average throughout the US. This also differs per state. Like California has higher taxes on their gas than Oklahoma does because they use some of their gas for roads, like other countries do. So, this has a huge impact on the type of cars people choose to drive, how much they choose to travel, and all of these things. So when we compare the kinds of automobiles driven, the kind of cars people have in different countries, we can find a direct relationship between that cost of fuel and fuel efficiency. So really high cost of fuel in Italy, France, the UK, Germany, Spain, South Korea, and comparatively a much lower cost in Canada and the United States. And we see that in the kind of cars that people choose to drive. So the average European car, they are so much smaller. So European car drivers pay almost or more than twice the amount for fuel as we do in the US and as people in Canada do. But they use 40% less fuel to drive the same distance. That means that their cars are way more fuel efficient. So we have to use 40% more fuel than they do to get that same distance. So even though our gas is cheaper, we're using a lot more of it because we have bigger cars that use a lot more gas. So with those taxes, the governments often charge road users to help build and repair roads by taxing fuel. Many European countries raise more money from fuel taxes than they spend on building and repairing roads. That means that they have all the money that they need to make sure that all of the roads are constantly fixed. In the US, most government entities are raising about 50% of the money that are needed for roads from fuel taxes. That means they have to get the money to fix the roads from somewhere else, which is why some areas might have roads that are fixed less often than others. And low fuel costs in the US encourages more travel, which increases road repair costs. This also increases the economy of some areas that are driven by tourists. Like, it's cheaper to travel, so we travel a lot, so a lot of these places get more visitors. But that means we're using the roads, which means our roads need to be repaired more. However, because of how we're taxing, we only make 50% of the money needed from those taxes. So our roads don't always get fixed as much as they maybe should. All right, so one big entity that we need to talk about when we're talking about fuel specifically is OPEC. So OPEC is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and this consists of 14 different countries. And OPEC nations control about 71% of the world's estimated oil reserves, which is about 1,700 billion barrels. So this is definitely a majority of the oil reserves. Increased oil production by the US and Russia reduced the demand because of the COVID-19 pandemic, reduced the influence of OPEC. So before COVID-19 and before the US and Russia really started producing more oil, OPEC had a huge control over our fuel prices and availability. But COVID-19, we stopped traveling so much. And now we are able to actually get a lot of our own oil. So OPEC has a little bit less influence than it did before. This is really hard to see. I forgot to fix it. But we can see the different countries in which are OPEC countries. So Saudi Arabia, Iraq, United Arab Emirates, Iran, Kuwait, Nigeria. Those are all OPEC countries. And then over here is the percent of total oil that they produce out of all the oil produced. So the US actually produces the most. Russia is really close behind, and then Saudi Arabia is in third. And we together produce not quite half, maybe 40%. All right, now let's look at energy consumption trends. So in 2019, the world energy consumption was around 14,000 million metric tons of oil equivalent, which is an increase from 15% over 10 years. Of this total, fossil fuels, oil, natural gas, and coal, were about 85%. That is a lot of non-renewable energy being used. Over 40% of the world energy consumption is by the 25 member countries of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development and developed nations of the world. So we talked about this when we talked about in lesson 1, the different kinds of energy that developed versus less developed or underdeveloped countries use. And industrialized countries use a lot of energy. We use a lot of energy. That just is the way that it is. So for available energy sources, oil makes up 33%, coal is 27%, natural gas is 24%, and then nuclear and hydropower and other renewables provide the rest. But a vast majority of our energy sources currently are non-renewable energy sources, which means we will eventually run out of them. That is not a question of whether we will or not. It is a question of when. So this has changed the world consumption by region. So the world over time has just increased quite a bit. Asia and Pacific have gone up the most. The OECD group as a whole has increased and kind of plateaued. And the United States, we've pretty much plateaued since the year 2000, meaning like we leveled out. So the primary factors that determine energy use are the political stability in oil-producing countries, world economic conditions, and then the price of oil. If things are cheap, you will use more of them. If things are not cheap, then we tend to use it less. Same goes for energy. So during the 1980s, energy costs in North America and Europe declined, and people became less concerned about energy consumption. So if we go back to that graph and we look at 1980, that's when we see a little blip, and that's when we see it really like kind of jump up for all of them because energy was cheap. So they used more energy to heat and cool their homes, bought more appliances, and then bought larger and larger and larger cars. So energy consumption behavior of most people is motivated by economics rather than a desire to wisely use energy resources. It's really hard for us to look at the amount of energy that we use and think that one day these sources won't be available. And so that's really not a motivator for people to stop. What is a motivator is the gas bill at the pump when you're filling up your car, or the utility bills that come to the house. It is money that is motivating, not really much else for most people. And over the past several years, world oil prices have become extremely volatile. They are changing constantly. It's just, it's a guess on what it'll be every day. And since OPEC and countries of the Middle East control over 40% of the world's oil production, and over 70% of the oil reserves. Political stability in this region is very important because it can very much affect our economic well-being, because energy is going to affect our economic well-being. All right, so this is just a graph showing factors that have affected crude oil prices over time. So OPEC reduced production, so it went up a little bit. 9/11, it dropped off. High world demand and limited supply meant that it bumped up a little bit. There was a recession in 2008, so that plummeted way, way, way down. And then we had here, COVID-19, coronavirus, it dropped off, and now it is on its way back up. All right, that is the end of this lesson. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you in the next one.